Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Olya Abasolo-Avchinnikova. I am an Olympian and the Education Manager at the International Testing Agency. So welcome to our first educational webinar of 2021. Those of you who have joined our series in the past, so the series of webinars in May and June of last year, welcome back. For anyone who is joining us for the first time, thank you very much for being here today. All right, so I will talk about today's topic in just a second. But at this point, I really want to introduce our partner. So I'm not sure, Terence, if you're there, maybe you can turn your camera on. Excellent.
Hello, everybody.
So I'm really happy to announce that joining us is Terence O'Rourke. And he is representing Informed Sport today, and that is our official supporter for the 2021 webinar series. So those of you who do not know Informed Sport, it's the global certification program designed to ensure that sport supplement products are not contaminated with prohibited substances banned in sport. So we really have, and it's a mouthful, we're really happy to have Informed Sports support with this program, which means that we can continue delivering these webinars and covering important topics with you, the global sport community. So those of you who have seen our previous webinars know that I love a good highlights reel. So maybe I will kick off this introduction of Informed Sport with a reel and then throw it over to you, Terence, to say a few words.
Thank you, Olya.
Great. Let's kick that off. Let's give it a second to load. So over to you, Terence.
Thank you, Olya. Good afternoon or good evening, good morning to everybody from across the world. It's a real pleasure to be here, not only taking part in this webinar, but also on a broader level to be supporting the ITA on the webinar series. I won't speak too much today. I literally just wanted to take a couple of minutes to introduce our program. As the video has shown, Informed Sport is a global testing program for the sports nutrition industry. As many of you will know, supplements continue to present a very significant risk to athletes across the world. Not only to athletes, but also to their support personnel, to the various ADOs and NADOs. And essentially what Informed Sport is, it's a program which has been designed to minimize the risk involved in athletes using supplements. There's no real data as to exactly how many elite athletes use supplements, but certainly from my experience in the last 10 years, it is quite a large majority. So Informed Sport is designed to try and take the risk out of that supplement's use and essentially to avoid what we call inadvertent doping. So that's an athlete using a product which is contaminated or in worse, been adulterated with a banned substance, which could then lead to an anti-doping violation. Informed Sport is based on two fundamental principles, and this is why we believe it provides the highest level of protection for athletes. The first one is that every batch of a product that's on the program must be tested. It must go through our laboratory where it is tested for banned substances. And the second fundamental pillar is that that batch cannot be released to market until it has been tested negative. So what we've done there is we have eliminated any chance of products being on the market which are not tested for banned substances and have come through as negative. Informed Sport's been going since 2008. In that sort of 12 years, we've developed into very much a global program. We have more than 1,100 products on the program now, and we work with customers in 40 different countries. We have laboratories in the UK and also in the United States that can do the testing for the program. And our aim has always been to provide the highest level of protection for athletes. LGC, which is the science company which owns the programs, has a long anti-doping heritage. We have in the past been a water laboratory. We do testing for all the animal sports, the Olympic Games and things like that. So we think we're in a very good position to continue providing the level of protection for athletes, which we are already doing. That's about it. We look forward to supporting the webinar series for the rest of the year. And if anybody does have any questions, then please do get in touch and I'd be delighted to answer them. But Olya, I wish you luck on your first webinar, and it's good to meet everybody, and best of luck.
Thank you very much, Terence. It is great to have your support on these sessions. And so this is our first session of a 12-part year-long series that will be publicly available. So thanks to Informed Sports' help, we can invest some time and resources into creating these sessions for you. I should note that they are mainly in English, and we realize that it's a barrier to access to many parts of the world. But and maybe I can do a little plug here. If you are joining from a national anti-doping organization or another organization that is able to support us with some translation support, we will be developing subtitles in other languages for these sessions in the near future. All right, so at this point, we can get into today's session. And I will just go over what you see on the screen, and then I will take some time to introduce the panelists who are joining me today. So, of course, it is quite general. We titled it as Setting Up for a Successful Year, Tips on Navigating the Anti-Doping System. And since we only have an hour together, it's a really quick stop tour of some of the key information that you need to know. Now, I know that we have a variety of members of the anti-doping system joining us. So for some of you, this may be a repeat of information that you already know. If you're an athlete or a coach, some of the information may be new or something that you may want to pass on to your community. So the first thing we'll do is go over the roles and responsibilities of key stakeholders. And then we'll cover some of the key changes to the World Anti-Doping Code, but specifically as it relates to the athletes. So of course, we won't be able to speak about all the changes, but if you have any questions, we'll do our best to answer those. We'll also provide you with some tips on specifically medications, supplements, and therapeutic use exemptions. But for all of those topics, we're going to be speaking in more detail on each one of them in future sessions. And we also have recordings of previous webinars if you want to take a look to get prepared for your year. So I don't want to speak the whole session. We'll try to make it as interactive as possible. You've seen a poll question pop up. We'll have a few more of those. We want to take your questions. And so we'll do this more of a Q&A style with my co-presenters who, without any further delay, I will now introduce. So Alexis Cooper is the Director of Education at Sport Integrity Australia, where she plans and delivers education on a wide range of sport integrity threats, including doping, match fixing, and illicit drugs. Sounds very serious. Alexis has a Bachelor of Media and Communications degree, a Master of Bioethics, and has worked in anti-doping for the last 6 years. Alexis is passionate about making complex topics seem simple, which is a skill very much needed for today's webinar, by using education as practical and engaging tool. And she has pioneered the use of a number of new technologies in anti-doping, including virtual reality, augmented reality, and mobile apps. So Alexis, thank you for being here today with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Elia, and hi to everyone around the world. It's very exciting.
And it's midnight for you, so thank you very much for staying up late.
That's okay, I've had a couple of coffees.
Excellent. Hopefully you'll sleep afterwards. And of course, when we speak about any anti-doping topic, an athlete perspective is key to bring theoretical concepts to life. So I would like to introduce Neville Wright, a former national team track and field sprinter turned bobsledder. So he represented Canada at 3 Olympic Games, 2010, 14, and most recently 2018, and at 8 World Championships in bobsleigh, but also on the track. Neville holds a Bachelor of Physical Education degree, majoring in sport performance and nutrition, and remedial massage therapy diploma. He's a sprint coach, and since retiring from sport, Neville has continued to work as a therapist, coach, speaker, along with athlete mentorship, working in safe sport, and chairing for the Diversity and Equity Committee for Athletes Can, the Association of Canada's national team athletes. Hi, Neville.
Hi, thanks for having me. And hi to everyone from around the world, from different time zones. Thanks for having me here.
So we've got the two extremes. I'm nice and in the middle at 2 o'clock in the afternoon in Switzerland, but Neville, it's 6 o'clock in the morning for you over in Calgary. So thanks for the early wake up as well. Really appreciate it.
No problem.
All right, so let's kick this discussion off with a brief overview of the anti-doping landscape. We've done this last year, so we'll really keep it high level. There are many stakeholders. What we'll focus on today is the role of WADA, the ITA, and that's often a common question, what does the ITA do? But also the NATOs and the IFs. So I am going to throw it over to you, Alexis, because I'm about to load up a slide that has a lot of information on it. So if we take a look here, this is the roles and responsibilities of national anti-doping organizations in accordance with the World Anti-Doping Code. Now we'll speak about what the World Anti-Doping Code is in just a second, but looking at this, if you're an athlete, it's quite difficult to understand what a NATO would do for you as an athlete. So perhaps, pun intended, you can decode this for us a little bit and speak about what the roles and responsibilities of NATOs are when it comes to the athletes.
Absolutely. So please don't even try to read all of that. It's very complicated. There's a lot of information on there. I think if we can summarize it into one sentence, the role of the National Anti-Doping Organization, the NATO, is to implement the World Anti-Doping Code in their country. So I think a good way of thinking about it is that an international federation looks after one sport in lots of countries, whereas a NATO looks after lots of sports in one country. So here in Australia, for example, we look after around 96 different sports, which are all played in Australia. The NATO is also really concerned with sport in that country. So for us, that's looking at Australian sport and Australian athletes. This means that we can test Australian athletes whether they are here at home or whether they're overseas. And we can also test any athletes from around the world who compete in our country. So as an example, if we have an Australian athlete who is competing over in Italy, we can plan a testing mission to happen over in Italy. Or if we have an Italian athlete who is competing in Australia, we could also test that Italian athlete. But what we can't do is test an we can't test an Italian athlete competing in, say, Canada with Neville. I think another big difference between the NATO and the International Federation is that IFs are usually focused on testing athletes who are really at the top of their game because they're competing internationally. Whereas in NATO, we are quite interested in testing and educating people before they get to that level. So anyone who might go on to represent Australia one day is someone who we might be doing more testing on and will certainly be doing more education on. So I think that explains a little bit of the difference between the NATO and the IF.
And there's certainly a bit of an overlap. We'll talk about that in a second, but maybe we can switch over, and thank you, Lex, for that. We can switch over to IF, roles and responsibilities, which is even longer and more complicated to decipher as an athlete or as a coach. We do work with a lot of international federations, and if we want to simplify the roles and responsibilities of international federations as it relates to the athletes, of course, in contrast with Alexis' explanation of the NATO role, the international federations set the anti-doping rules for their sport or the sports that that are under the authority of the International Federation. So that means all competitions authorized or organized by the IF. Now, what's important also is that there are testing pools in international federations, whether you can call it a registered testing pool, it may have another name, which means that athletes would be required to provide whereabouts. Once again, we won't talk about whereabouts in too much detail, and I feel like I'll repeat myself with that line today a lot. But what's important to note is that athletes must be available for sample collection if they are in that testing pool of that federation, which means out of competition. But an athlete does not have to be in a testing pool to be tested. If they are attending a senior world championships or a junior world championship event, not having been included in a testing pool before, they may be tested under the authority or the jurisdiction of that event. So that's an important distinction here to make. Of course, some of the roles and responsibilities are similar in terms of pursuing anti-doping rule violations within a sport for an IF, within a country for a NATO. And a key point here is planning and implementing, evaluating and promoting education is becoming a key component now. So international federations, of course, have a responsibility to do that for international level athletes and as well as athlete support personnel. So Neville, looking at all this, as a 3-time Olympian and you're a multi-sport athlete, you've been tested a few times in your career. So when we spoke about this first, I always say that the first time I was tested was by my IF at an event, but normally an athlete should be tested in theory by their NATO first in their home country. So that was your experience in Canada. So maybe you can share a little bit of that first experience with us, and then tell us whether or not it was any different from when you started to travel and compete abroad.
Yeah, so my first testing experience was actually while I was in university. I had so that year I won a conference and national championships, and leading into conference championships, my coach actually kind of said, I would expect to be, expect that you'll probably get tested. And I was kind of like, why? He's like, if you're doing really well, like that might happen. And lo and behold, after the race, the drug testers came for me. And I was actually okay. Like I was comfortable because I had a support, like my coach was there with me to walk me through it. And then they kind of walked me through everything. I was probably thrown off a little bit of how they collect the sample. I was a little bit shy and everything, but that was okay. And then after that, I started to get tested more regularly in university and then outside in track. And then when I switched to bobsledding and I went over to Europe, the testing protocol was actually roughly around the same. I think the only time there's something that was a bit different was when I got tested in this one country, and when I came in, the room smelled like smoky and everything, and it seemed like someone was in there. And I asked, and they weren't sure. But then what I did was that I noted it. So I mean, having that experience of being tested, I noted it on my forms that so just to make sure to protect myself. So I thought that was really important. So, but other than that, I think everything was pretty much the same across the board, whether I was in Canada, in the US, or overseas.
Yes, thank you for that. And thanks for the insight. And I think what's important to note is that in theory, and we all strive very hard to make sure that no matter what country you represent, where you compete, what sport you compete in, that you're tested to the same standard, to the same quality. Of course, it will differ. I myself have been in a smoky room before. And I think I started competing in a time when there was still beer in the waiting room fridge. But, times have changed and things have certainly evolved. And I think the purpose of today's presentation is also to go through some of this evolution and really the high standards that exist now to make sure that these things don't happen anymore. But before we move on to the role of WADA and the ITA, which I want to speak about, Alexis, I'll throw it back to you because we all know that there's a lot of overlap. And you can see it here with our brief explanations between the role of NATO and between the role of an IF. Stories like an athlete being tested on the same day by different people or having to go through multiple education programs. So can you speak a little bit about how this may affect athletes, these roles and responsibilities?
Absolutely. So there's definitely some overlap. You know, both NADOs and IFs have their own testing programs, their own education programs. So there can be overlap, and then we appreciate that it really can be a bit confusing for athletes, and sometimes even a bit frustrating. So what the overlap means is that as an athlete, you can be tested by either your international federation or by your NADO. And this means that in theory, like you say, you could be tested twice a week, or even worse, twice in one day. We have heard horror stories of that happening. We do try to avoid it and work closely with the international federations to prevent it, but unfortunately it does occasionally happen. It also means that sometimes both the International Federation and the NADO will both really want you to do some education, maybe before an event or just part of regular annual training. And again, we do try to work together to prevent it happening, but it does happen sometimes. From my perspective, personally, I would much rather do education twice than be tested twice in the same day. But yeah, we try to avoid it. I think the good news is that as an athlete, you can only be on one testing pool. So you can be on the International Federation registered testing pool, or you can be on the NADO's registered testing pool, but you can't be on both. So at least you only have to do whereabouts once.
And the whereabouts process is getting much easier too with the Athlete Central app and all the other tools that exist. Even with Neville, we spoke last week about how complicated that you sat down for a couple of hours just to fill out your whereabouts the first time you had to do it with your coach. Wasn't the most user-friendly process, right?
When I actually, because back when I was in track, the way how you would fill out your forms, it was actually like a form template, and you had to, there wasn't no auto-populate or anything. I had to actually fill kind of like everything in. And then when I switched over to bobsledding, I think there's a change in program, and then they had that system in place where there's like, you know, you can auto-populate, and but I didn't really know about that. So then it wasn't until like we got like a notification that, like, you know, there's a filing failure, I guess, because I was filing my whereabouts, but it was the old version, I guess. So then we had to sit down. We sat down for like 2 hours trying to figure out the system. The system has changed quite a bit, where now it's a lot easier to navigate. But I do remember that challenge of switching, pretty much doing 3 transitions from the forms to the new system, and then now the improved system.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes it a bit complicated, is each stakeholder may have a different system. Now it's becoming more and more centralized, with Athlete Central being a key resource, but there are still these discrepancies, how a TUE is filed in some cases, that we have to figure out. So not an easy process for athletes to figure out, but we're doing our best to make resources accessible to you so that you learn these tips and tricks and hopefully find it easier to protect yourself. So let's take a look at these two organizations here. You may recognize the logos, especially the one on the left. And maybe we can launch a poll here with a question to see what you think the difference is between the World Anti-Doping Agency and the ITA. So the most popular answer is that the ITA reports to WADA, to the World Anti-Doping Agency. And I guess that's a bit of a trick question because in some ways, yes, the ITA follows the rules that are set forth by the World Anti-Doping Agency and the code. So we'll talk about that in a second. But in terms of a governance structure, we in fact do not report to WADA. So I can see how this can be a little bit of a tricky question to ask our audience. But thank you very much for participating and for sharing your answers. So the definition that you see here on the screen, I wouldn't call it a definition or a description. The World Anti-Doping Agency is the independent international body responsible for harmonizing anti-doping policies in all sports in all countries. So WADA is 21 years old now. And when it was created, it was an effort to make sure that going back to this idea of athletes being tested the same way, no matter what sport they compete in, what country they represent. And so it was a massive amount of work to get all of that started. And now we have a code and a set of standards, which we'll talk about. So the big difference here is that the International Testing Agency is also an independent international organization, but we offer anti-doping services to international federations, major event organizers, other organizations requiring support. So what we do is we help international federations primarily, but also other organizations follow these rules. So we implement anti-doping programs. We run testing, we run education programs, sample storage, reanalysis, some of that legal work, etc. So we did want to address this, and of course, describe to you what these organizations are, because that's a question that comes up quite often. Neville, I'll throw it back to you here with a question. When you started competing, I guess WADA was only a couple of years old, right? It was so it was a very different anti-doping landscape back then. You've witnessed these changes as you switched sports and started competing on the Olympic circuit and throughout your career. So would you say now that the system is more complex, and is it harder or easier for athletes to navigate the system?
I find that now it is a lot easier compared to what it was before, especially now that you can do it on the app. So it's like, say for example, if you need to make a change, whereas like, you know, your 1 hour window might change, or you're going to be in a different location, it's really easy just to make those adjustments. So I found that it was a lot easier before, or easier now than it was before.
And it is becoming more complex, the system. So if we actually look at all the standards that exist in the code, it may seem like it is getting more complicated, but it's also getting more complicated because it is protecting the athletes. So I think there's a positive in all of this, although it is taking much more time for athletes to really fully understand it. So we've talked about the World Anti-Doping Code already a few times. So if we want to look at the structure of how these rules are made, they exist, of course, in the form of the code. This is the document that harmonizes the anti-doping policies. But also what's important to remember is that it's not just the athletes that are bound to rules and regulations. We've already spoken about the international federations. We've spoken about the NATOs, who are bound to specific rules and regulations. So what you'll see at the bottom here are a set of standards that bound other areas of anti-doping to very strict standards as well. So here you can see laboratories, for example, what they should do, testing, investigation, therapeutic use exemptions, etc. What's key to note here are two new standards. So the International Standard for Education and the International Standard for Results Management. So for results management, I won't talk about it too much, but we'll have a webinar in February, and I'm going to say this a lot. We will have a webinar in February on everything legal. So we'll cover a lot of this stuff then. But very briefly, the International Standard for Results Management sets out a clear framework for how to deal with anti-doping rule violations, things like case review, investigation, provisional suspensions, right to a fair hearing, disqualification, etc. The one that I know quite well and I am quite excited about is the International Standard for Education. It makes education a mandatory part of the anti-doping program for the first time. So perhaps, Alexis, you can tell us a little bit more, especially in your role as the Director of Education for Sport Integrity Australia, how the standard will impact the athletes in the future.
I think it's actually a really fantastic thing for athletes, really. It's making sure that all anti-doping organisations are doing everything we can to protect athletes and really try to prevent, especially those accidental doping cases. One of the key principles is that athletes should receive education before they ever get tested. So Iaf and Neville, I don't know what your experience was, but certainly hopefully all athletes in future will be able to actually get education before they get their test. So as an athlete, I think what you can expect is that you're going to probably get a lot more education opportunities given to you, and probably a lot more opportunities for you to ask questions. Just like this one, you know, I think this is fantastic. So it should be great.
And both Neville and I, we haven't had the opportunity to get that education. But actually, that's a good point, Neville. You said that you asked a ton of questions when you were first tested. And you were making lists of like muffins with poppy seeds, all kinds of things. And I guess that was your way to get informed, right?
Yeah, I was like, it was when I was first tested, I had no clue of anything, and I was kind of like, well, what do I need to let them know? And I mean, I was naming everything, like from food I was eating to like, you know, I had a bottle of Gatorade, I had this, I had that, and it was kind of like, you don't have to give us all that. We just need to know like the supplements you're taking. It's like, okay, I just wanted to make sure I was thorough and I wasn't omitting anything as well. So I mean, it was, I guess, a bit intimidating. Like, even though I had my coach support me, it was a bit intimidating just because I had no clue what I was walking into.
Mm-hmm. And I think the biggest, the most difficult part for athletes is the prohibited list, which we can actually talk about right now. And it's really a good thing that you bring it up, is because we still have a massive number of inadvertent doping cases, which means cases that of athletes who test positive without having any intention to. So maybe I will throw in another poll question here, and I think that's our last poll question about the prohibited list. And you should see it on your screen, but we'll ask you how often the prohibited list gets updated. So you can give us your opinion on that. The World Anti-Doping Code gets updated every 5-6 years. So 2005, I think, 2000. You can tell me, Alexis. I had this earlier, but what were the years that it was updated, the code?
Oh, the last one was 2015, and then before that was 2009. 2015.
2009, 2015, 2021. Now we can see here close to 60%, or I can see, I'll show you the results in a second. Almost all of you now have responded to how often the prohibited list gets updated, which is, I would say, the 8th standard. So we have the 7 standards that you see on the bottom of your screen, and the prohibited list is another standard with the code. So let's end the polling, and I'll share the results with you. Most of you have gotten this question right. So the prohibited list does get updated at least once a year. A few of you have selected the other answer, but yes, it is at least annual. So we'll come back to the prohibited list. I've put it up on the screen here to show it to you as part of the larger framework, but I won't talk about it too much just now because I want to come back to the prohibited list, supplements, medications, some of the tools and resources all together after we talk about this larger system. But thank you very much for participating in the poll. One part here that we haven't looked at is kind of on, I guess, on the right of your screen, you will see that there's a white box talking about anti-doping rules of signatories. So it's important to note that yes, you have the code, you have the standards, you have the prohibited list, but each federation, each stakeholder of the system will update their specific rules in accordance with the code. So depending on which sport you compete in, it is important that you check the latest anti-doping rules in your sport. So there are some differences between different sports there. All right, so we'll come back to this prohibited list in just a second. But in the meantime, we can talk about the anti-doping rule violations because there's been some changes there on the topic of major changes to the code. I would give a shout out first to the Japan Anti-Doping Agency for the visuals, because I really do like the little visual explanations of each anti-doping rule violation. And here you can see what has changed as of January 1st. Now, there are some changes to the wording of 2 of the anti-doping rule violations, but what's important is that there's a new anti-doping rule violation, number 11, and this particular ADRE is designed to give more protection for persons reporting a potential violation. What's also worth noting on this list is that 7 of these anti-doping rule violations apply not just to the athletes, but also to anyone in the anti-doping system. So that's your coaches, athlete support personnel, medical staff, and even administrators and other members of the community. And we can talk about this change also in just a bit, the fact that now there are more people who are responsible in the anti-doping system. Okay, so let's take a look at these key changes here. I will once again remind you that these are not all the changes, but those that perhaps have the most impact on the athletes, and those that the athletes really need to know about. And Alexis, maybe you can give us some of the key ones that we haven't mentioned yet, that may be on this slide, but maybe some other ones that we've discussed prior to this webinar that you would like to share with the audience.
Sure. I think one of the really important ones for athletes is that the in-competition period has changed. So previously it used to be that the in-competition window, when certain substances become banned, but it might not have been before, that used to begin around 12 hours, I think, before your actual event. And now they've changed it so it always starts at midnight before your competition. And I think that just makes it so much easier for athletes, because you can just go, you don't need to do any maths or calculations and when does it start, what hour does it kick in. It's midnight every time, unless an international federation makes their own rule and has an exemption approved by WADA. So I think that's a really nice, simple one. Some of the other changes that I think are really fantastic are that there's now longer bans for aggravating circumstances. So cases where it is a really bad kind of doping cases. So it might be a repeat offender. It might be someone who's lying to an anti-doping authority. There is now a bit more flexibility to give a longer ban when that happens. And likewise, I think the other really important thing is that there's actually a bit more flexibility in athlete cases where they might have used a substance not for performance enhancing benefit. So illicit drugs out of competition is a classic example, where you can actually get your sanction reduced. And that also applies to lower level athletes, unlikely to be international athletes, but especially for NADOs, if we're testing at kind of recreational level, for example, and something goes wrong, we have a bit more flexibility if they've never had education. So there's some really, really good changes in there, I think, which are trying to make it easier and more fair for athletes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And you can see here new definitions to add some of that clarity. You know, protected person definition, which has many references, but you know, it really makes a difference for youth athletes, minor athletes. Recreational athlete makes a difference for us as well. Like you said, gives flexibility to really separate that from international level high performance athlete that may be in a registered testing pool, for example. So many changes, some more of them here on the screen, new standards that we've talked about, new responsibilities. I would say one that I really like here, the notable change is that the code applies to more people, which I've spoken about before. So board members, officers, directors, employees like myself who are involved in any aspect of doping control are now held accountable, which is a really big change, and I think that's very important. The last check mark here is the Athletes Anti-Doping Rights Act. So we can talk about this one for a few minutes, because I think it's a significant, I wouldn't say it's a change, but it's I think it's something worth noting, that there is now an act that is in place. And so, of course, much work has been done and much work remains to be done in the area of athlete advocacy and athlete voice, but I think this was a great first step by the WADA Athlete Committee to get this approved and enacted as of January 1st. If we look at the purpose of this document, it's to ensure that athlete rights within anti-doping are clearly set out, accessible, and universally applicable. So while this document itself is not a legal or legally binding document, it points out the right place in the code or standards where more information can be found. So of course here you can see we're putting a lot of text that has links, and we do this because we want to give you the resources. So while you cannot necessarily click on the link right now, we will be sharing the files with everyone right after the session. And so if you want to forward it or share it or watch this recording with your sport community, then you can really take advantage of these links. So the act is made up of two parts. One part sets out the rights that are found in the code and in the standards. And the second part sets out the recommended athlete rights. So these are not found anywhere in the code, in the standards, but they're recommended to be adopted for best practice. And so it's an interesting area here where we can still push athlete advocacy forward with some of these recommended athlete rights that are not necessarily implemented at the moment, but maybe in the future. Worth mentioning here, this was put together by the WADA Athlete Committee, and they are the voice of athletes in the anti-doping world. So they really took the lead here to create this document, and I am sure that they are welcome to hear your feedback and your impressions. We'll put some contact information, not just ours, but WADA's as well, if you want to ask any questions on the Athletes Anti-Doping Rights Act. So Neville, you are retired now, but you are involved with Athletes Can. So it's an independent organization that represents Canada's national team athletes. This kind of ties into this athlete advocacy piece. Do you have any perspective on these changes on the act? And is there anything else that you would want to see changed or added in the near future?
Well, I think seeing changes happening for athletes where it's still a slow process, I believe, with a lot of changes. But the goal and the hope where I would love to see is the athlete's voice being amplified in regards to whether it be in testing, policies, mandates within their own NSOs, things like that, just so that pretty much a situation where athletes are empowered and to speak up, and that those resources or anything that kind of affects the athlete is athlete focused, where it's about them achieving higher performance and pretty much have the athlete's best interest at heart is what the goal, or at least I love to see.
Mm-hmm. We're still getting there. We're working on it, and I think it's not just the WADA Athlete Committee alone that would make these changes, but it's rather each organization making sure that the athlete's voice is heard, whether it's, I don't know, a session like this or more formal commitments or more formal involvement. I think all these make a difference. But also, I think as athletes, we sometimes underestimate how important our voice is if we're more proactive. So I know that I was not engaged when I was competing, but I know that I could have spoken up much more and have been my own advocate much more, knowing what I know now. So we hope that maybe this inspires some of the athletes listening in to become more involved. Excellent. So we've covered a lot of changes here. We've covered some of the stakeholders, and these are a few resources that may be useful, especially to the athletes, not having to go through the entire code and not having to go through the entire standard, although you're more than welcome to. You can look at the ADEL resource, which is the athlete's guide to the significant changes in the code to get more informed. So very useful resource there. Alexis, is there anything else that we haven't mentioned here that you would recommend as further resources to learn about the code and the standards?
I think some NADOs and international federations have already done a great job of trying to translate it for their athletes. Athletics, for example, I saw that they published a great kind of code change document. We have a free online course that you can do, it takes about 20 minutes, that teaches you about the code changes. And then social media accounts, I think, of other NADOs, such as in the UK, in the US, New Zealand, they all publish really great frequent updates, which I think the more you follow, the better in anti-doping world. You can never have too many updates.
And if an athlete has a question, who do they go to, the IF or the NADO, and when?
Now that one is a bit more tricky. It probably depends on the question. So if it's a question about whereabouts and you're in the International Federation RTP, then best to talk to your International Federation. If it's a question about education, for example, whoever has developed that resource, I'm sure would be able to provide you more information. It probably depends on the topic on that one.
Mm-hmm. But you've also made a key point here that there are resources that are available. We use a lot of the WADA resources because it's really our go-to. Now ADEL has a lot of these guides and online courses separated between national level, international level athletes. So really we always pull back to that. But then again, using the example of Australia, all of your resources are publicly available and they are free to use for anyone, not just Australian athletes.
Absolutely. So yeah, there's free online courses. We have a mobile app that you can download, which has lots of information and tools to check supplements and medications and TUEs. That's called the Sport Integrity app. And lots of other NADOs have fantastic things to complement the wider resources that are already out there that are already fantastic. So I think there's lots of places that athletes can go for really good information.
And I think we are acutely aware, once again, of the languages, that most of the resources are in English. And I think that's that would be one of my focus areas, is to make it more accessible in other languages. And that's where, if I could see one change, is where I would like to be able to communicate with all members of our global anti-doping community who otherwise may not be able to join the session and make the most out of the session because of the language barrier. But all work in progress. Excellent. Okay, so we'll come back to this prohibited list. And once again, I have put right away here the Athlete's Guide to the Prohibited List, because it is a good document, a very comprehensive document. And it is a list of substances and methods that are banned in sport, but it can be sometimes hard to understand. So perhaps the good first step for the athletes is to look at this guide. Once again, this document gets updated at least annually. So usually it comes out on October 1st to be in effect on January 1st. So just a couple of weeks ago, we've had this new list go into effect. Now, I'll throw it over to you, Neville. I'm guessing you didn't use the prohibited list when you were checking your medications. Did you use any other resources?
So when it came to checking medications, my go-to was always Global Dro. So that was a really I put it as one of my home screens for on my phone, so I can access it easy. So if I was like in a store, I could just kind of look things up. And then when I went overseas, I remember I was actually really sick. I was in Germany, and the team doc gave me our team German doctor gave me a bunch of medications, and I wasn't sure, and I couldn't really interpret everything on there. So I tried Global Dro, and then I also used another app, was antidoping.ch, and that one actually would let me pick what country I got the medications from. So I was actually able to go through the list and see what I could take or what was okay. And then if I didn't find the certain ingredients on there, or I wasn't sure, then I just didn't take those medications.
Mm-hmm. And that's interesting too. When traveling, you would not necessarily be able to find that medication very easily. What do you recommend, Alexis, for athletes who don't see their flag in their country on this list on Global Dro?
It's true. So there's not that many countries on there. So if you're not one of them, I think that the best thing to do would still be to use Global Dro. What it does for people in those countries with the flags that are listed there, it means that in Australia, for example, I can enter the brand name of a product straight into Global Dro, for example, Panadol or Nurofen, and it will tell me if it's banned or not. But what it means, if you're not from one of those countries, is that you just need to enter, instead of the brand name, you would have to enter in the ingredients of that product. So, for example, it might be ibuprofen, might be paracetamol, whatever the actual active ingredient is that you want to check, then you can type it in. Doesn't matter kind of which country you choose on there, and it will tell you whether that active ingredient is banned in sport or not. So that one's really useful, I think, for everyone around the world.
And there is other as well that you can click on, which will give you a list of the national anti-doping organizations that would be your resource in your home country. So if I guess, Alexis, maybe would you agree with me that you would want to go to your NATO first to see if they have a resource in your language, perhaps, and then combine that with Global Dro to get the best information?
Yes, absolutely. Excellent advice.
And yes, your team doctors as well. Use your support personnel. You should have, especially on the national team level, knowledgeable support personnel who would be able to guide you in checking of those medications. So hopefully that is the case for those listening in today. So I want to talk to you, Alexis, about one disclaimer on the prohibited list that freaked me out when I first saw it, and it may scare some of the athletes, but the disclaimer is that the substances and methods included in each category is not the complete list. They are only examples of types of substances that would be included in that category. I can imagine that this would make an athlete nervous, like it did for me. What does that really mean? You have the prohibited list, but it's not a complete list?
Pretty much. It's a really great question. It comes up a lot. So one of the biggest challenges I think that anti-doping regulators face is that new substances or chemical compounds are being developed every single day. And scientifically, it could be possible to take something that is on the prohibited list, an actual chemical compound, and make a really, really small change to it, even just changing, one atom. And that would create a new substance with a new name, but it would still act in the same way as the prohibited substance, but it wouldn't be listed on that list because they've made such a tiny change to it. So that's why it's really impossible almost to list absolutely everything on the prohibited list. And it explains why that clause is there. So that's why, you have things like Global Dro that can really help. And why it's really important to check things with your NATO.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think I really needed an explanation for that one because it sounds so intimidating to know, well, how am I supposed to get the complete list? But there are resources that exist out there.
Exactly.
Let's talk about supplements too. And I see here one of the top questions in the Q&A is about an official list of nutrients that tested positive for doping tests. So if I'm correct to assume that the nutrients is referring in fact to supplements. And actually, I don't know, is there an official list, if you're referring to nutrients as supplements, is there an official list of supplements that tested positive or have known to be contaminated? Is there something like that you keep track of on your national level?
In Australia, there is. So in the Sport Integrity app that you can download for free, if you search for a supplement that we know has either got a banned ingredient listed on the label or that a laboratory has tested that product and found that it contains a banned ingredient, it will come up with a giant warning saying, do not take this, do not take this. We're not the only ones that do that. I know the US also have a list of substances that of supplements that they know contain banned ingredients, but there isn't a global one so far as I know.
And perhaps we can flip that over, and instead of looking for ones that are not allowed, I think what we can do in the area of supplements, which is really, really complicated and tricky at times to stay safe and protected if you've decided to take supplements, is to check whether the supplement that you've chosen is certified. And here, of course, we work with Informed Sport as our supporter for the webinar program. There are many others out there, many other types of supplement certification services, and they're all different. So for example, we like Informed Sport because it's batch testing. Some other ones are specific to certain countries. So there are differences between all of these resources. But what they do is these will tell you whether or not a product has been tested, in some cases which batch, and if it's safer, it's never 100% safe, but safer to take. And I guess, Alexis, would your recommendation be one of these resources, or do you have your own that you use to check supplements?
Yeah, absolutely. So we work with Informed Sport, and there's another company called Hasta in Australia, and they're kind of the two main ones that sell supplements in Australia. So in the app, what we do is actually provide a list of batch tested products that are sold in Australia that athletes can go and buy. I know that some of these programs also have their own apps, which are global. So I think NSF has one already where you can search for batch tested supplements, and I believe Informed Sport have one on the way, which is very exciting. And that's certainly what we recommend. It's just the risk is really too high. So if you are an athlete that can be tested, you really have to be using a batch tested supplement, if at all. In Australia, we have one athlete every month who tests positive to a supplement inadvertently, which is really heartbreaking. And they get, serious bans from sport. And it's just not worth it to use something that isn't batch tested when there's so many options out there on the market which have been tested.
Definitely. Neville, you took supplements throughout your career as well. What are some of the things that you did to protect yourself?
So yeah, anytime I would take supplements, because I was very diligent on making sure that the first two, the Informed Sport and NSF logos were on the supplement, just because I knew that they're batch tested. I know there's some that will say like WADA approved, which I know WADA doesn't approve supplements. So like those are the main ones, and I would actually go on the website and scroll through of all the different supplements that have it. So, and then if pretty much if a supplement didn't have any of those specific two for me, they didn't have it on there, I wouldn't use it. So then I end up staying with certain product lines, just because I knew they had it, I've been tested on it, and I was fine. So I kind of stayed with those ones. I didn't really like to experiment with other supplement companies, especially if they didn't have that emblem on there.
Yeah. And we will talk about supplements. Once again, I think that's a really key discussion. We'll spend an entire hour on supplements in one of our sessions. Maybe do a little battle of the pros and cons, because that's not something we're discussing today. We're focused more on giving the resources, but that will come as well. And another plug is that we do have a recorded session. If you really are eager to get more informed on supplements, you can watch that on our website as well. Okay, so I think we are quickly running out of time, and this is our last point for today's therapeutic use exemptions. So we've covered prohibited list, medications and supplements, but what happens when you need to take a medication that is prohibited for your health? So therapeutic use exemptions are, of course, a solution to take the needed medicine and to have a permission to take it within the context of sport or within the context of being an athlete. But it isn't always an easy process to follow. So Alexis, how would you guide the athletes and their support personnel? First step, I guess, is knowing whether you actually need a therapeutic use exemption or not. So is there a way to check that?
There is, and it is challenging. It's a really tricky place to be. So there's the two categories of in advance and kind of retroactive TUE. So in some cases, athletes need to have this in advance TUE before they can take that substance. And every ADO is required to have a list on their website for people who are required to have that, is my understanding. So it will be different if you're competing in an international event or if you're competing in a national event in your own country. So to make it kind of simple, I think the best advice is if you're competing in an international event, you should check with the International Federation list or the event organizer. So for example, if it's the Olympics, the IOC requirements. And if you're competing in a national event in your own country, you should check with your NADO or your RADO. But a good rule of thumb is even if you need to use a prohibited substance for a medical reason, no matter what, a good starting point is to assume that you should have all your paperwork for a TUE ready. You should always have the medical records to support you using that, and your doctor should know what the threshold is that they need to meet to give you that ingredient or that substance. So always be prepared, but you can check online depending on the competition.
Exactly. So I guess there are a few things. One is finding out whether or not you actually need a TUE. We do receive TUE applications for substances that are not prohibited at times. Very elementary, but yes, there is a way to check. USADA, I think, has a check as well that you can use to go through a set of questions. Australia as well, to find out whether you actually need one. Once you find out that you do need a TUE for a valid medical reason, the next step is finding out what documents you need. And there's a checklist link on your screen, and then finding out where to file it. So I guess those two things are very, very key. So we've talked about this. Sometimes the athletes don't know where to go to the NADO or to the IAF, but there's a way to check, right, Alexis? Or you can guide them as well when they're not.
Yes, again, it kind of depends just on where that competition is. But either way, whoever you reach out to will be able to help, and either say, yes, come to us, or go to someone else. So,
yes. And
yeah, I would check before putting in all the paperwork.
And I guess the extra layer on top of this all, and I know it's not very straightforward, but that we do process therapeutic use exemptions as the International Testing Agency for a number of federations. So we work with about 45. If you're not sure, there's a link on this screen that you can then receive, you will receive by email. You can click on. It is our therapeutic use exemptions page that will tell you what you need to do, and it will tell you which federations we work with in terms of therapeutic use exemptions. We've put our webinar link in here as well if you want to take a look. Okay, so landscape, some tips and tricks, major changes to the code. We really went super fast through everything, but we hope that for those listening in, it was a good introduction and that it was a useful discussion that took place over the last hour. Of course, the key here is to get informed and engaged in your own athlete coach, athlete support personnel journey. Before we move on to the questions from the audience, maybe I'll give the floor one last time for final comments from, I wouldn't say one last time because maybe I'll give you some questions from the audience. But any final thoughts about any advice or tips that we have not yet discussed for our audience to make sure that they start the year right? So I'll start with you, Alexis, and then maybe hand it over to Neville.
Sure. I think it's fantastic that everyone here is engaged in anti-doping education and listening. My tip would be to take it seriously and make sure that you participate in as many of these and do as much kind of online training as you possibly can, or face-to-face training if you get the opportunity. You know, I spend a lot of time talking to sanctioned athletes who have done, you know, who didn't mean to get caught doping. They either didn't know the rules or they didn't check a medication. And it really does change their life for the worse. And it's really heartbreaking to see. So taking it seriously and being informed would be my big takeaway. But you guys are already doing that, which is fantastic.
Over to you, Neville. Thank you, Alexis.
Yeah, I agree with Alexis, where I think it's very important for athletes to do as much education as possible. So take every interaction, every opportunity for any type of resources that are out there to improve your education and awareness as an athlete. And yeah, just so that way, then even when if you are going to take supplements or if you need to take certain medications, knowing that in the end you're responsible for what goes into your body. So being proactive and taking those necessary steps.
Mm-hmm. And here you can see for athletes, I mean, athlete support personnel, there's many roles that we really recommend Adele, but there are administrators who work in the day-to-day of the anti-doping, of management of an anti-doping program. So throwing it back to the WADA code implementation support program. So there are a series of webinars on key changes, standards, and all the technical stuff that may be worthwhile for the administrators to tune into. So lots of resources out there. Of course, still a few language limitations, but they do exist, and we hope to make them more accessible in the coming months. So I've thrown a bunch of useful contacts on here as well with more links in case you find those helpful. But we do have a couple of minutes to go now to the audience. And thank you to everyone writing and saying where you are from and where you're joining us from, what sport you do. So it's great to see such an international community joining. And we'll go to the questions now and see how many we can answer to our best ability. So we did speak about nutrients, and I see the clarity here. Is there an official list of nutrients that are tested positive for doping tests, and kind of a black and white list? Unfortunately, it's not that black and white. There's the prohibited list for medications and supplements, for medications and methods that are prohibited. And the supplements, we take the route of suggesting those that have been tested rather than keeping a list of those that have been contaminated, especially with batch production of supplements, that one batch may differ from another. So I hope that helps answer that question from the Q&A. Now, the next question we have is from Mike Cook, who asks if the IFs notify an individual that they are included in the registered testing pool. So yes, the IFs do notify, and this is kind of international standard for testing and investigations. There's an obligation to notify athletes of the inclusion in the testing pool. Most of the time is done by email. It's very legally long, lengthy letter explaining the rights and obligations of the athletes when they are included in the testing pool. And then it sets out some deadlines as to the things that they need to do and when they need to do them, such as providing their whereabouts and how they would do that. So I hope, Mike, that answers your question. Let's take a look at a few more. We've got a few coming in, so thank you for staying so engaged. So another question from an anonymous attendee: will WADA be conducting COVID tests as it too affects the athletes? So of course, COVID, we almost purposely decided not to talk about COVID and vaccines because we really follow WADA's leadership and guidance closely when it comes to vaccinations, when it comes to the safety of vaccinations. I know the question was whether or not they will be on the prohibited list. So we don't know whether WADA will be conducting any tests, or whether, you know, perhaps talking about Tokyo Olympic Games, whether the organizers will do that. But we will follow the guidelines very closely and make sure that we're following those rules that are set forth. And I don't know, Alexis, if you have any thoughts on this question about COVID and if you have any guidelines nationally.
Not so much on the vaccines, just that, yeah, there's ongoing protection for athletes and staff during the testing process. So.
Mm-hmm. And we should also note that each country has their own regulations too. So for us working on the international level, we are dealing with having to follow different rules and regulations when we test in different countries. So just an extra layer there of complexity, but we'll do what we have to protect both the staff that are working in the anti-doping system, but also the athletes especially. So I'm just looking further into this list of questions. And I think we have more questions in terms of supplements, and for valid reasons, because it's quite complicated. Which nutrients contain prohibited substances? Once again, if we're talking about food, that may be, and do you have any thoughts on that? Because that's been a recent discussion, Alexis, in terms of food products being contaminated with prohibited substances. Maybe you can offer some advice on that. Contaminated meats, even fish.
Yeah, so I understand WADA has issued some guidance on contaminated meat, especially with clenbuterol. And I think one of the best pieces of advice for athletes was to always document where they eat red meat from. So I think there was a couple of specific countries, Mexico, China, Guatemala. I could be guessing.
Yeah.
But I think it's just really important to document those ones as an athlete and check the wider advice, which will be much more thorough than what I know off the top of my head.
And yeah, this is a really tricky one in terms of food contamination, because it really comes to such complicated things like how the animals are raised and what they're fed, and that translates into supplement of prohibited substances being in your food. So very, very difficult discussion. But if you are eating in those regions that are identified as regions where you could have potential contamination, recording which restaurant you went to, where you purchased your food, is the best way to protect yourself. The same way you would record which medications you're taking, which supplements you're taking, if you have made the decision to eat meat or fish, even in some cases in those areas. So we do have a lot of these similar questions on supplements, nutrition, production of supplement as well. And maybe I will save all of those for those future sessions as well. We'll be really able to answer those questions in detail, as well as some of the questions about the possibility of somebody testing positive. It's really hard for us to tell the possibility of someone being testing positive because there are so many details and circumstances. So I wouldn't be able to tell you how likely someone is to test positive. And I would love to have this magic vision, but unfortunately, we don't know those kinds of possibilities and risk levels. Another question is, why would you encourage athletes to take supplements? What is the intent? And I think, Neville, at some points you took supplements when the doctor has recommended it for health reasons. Is that correct?
Yeah. So and because I was sick, or like, you know, addressed, like for example when I was overseas, and you know, I was having certain issues where it was like migraines, or I was having issues with breathing and things like that. So the doctors recommended certain medications. So that's the only time I think they would really recommend in that case. But then in the end, it's still up to you if you want to take it, even if it's even if it's not on a ban list, or even if say, you know, you happen to get well, usually the doctors at those moments won't give you something that requires a TUE, but when it comes down to it, it's your choice whether or not you want to take it. But they don't normally recommend or say, like, give out supplements or anything else in the card.
And there's a wide range of opinions as well on supplements. And so to answer, you know, Elaine, I hope we answering your question here. Why would you encourage athletes to take supplements? It's really a calculation of risks and benefits, whether it's something that is needed for your health, and that is the best alternative to perhaps a prohibited medication, or medication that you do not want to take for whatever reason, or whether you really are taking it and you feel like it's helping your recovery, but it is tested, batch tested. So some of that decision making, once you've gone through that process and you decide that it's worth it for you, for your personal case, to take supplements, then you can. But let's get into the supplement discussion later on, because there's just so much to talk about when it comes to supplements. Takeshi, a question about whereabouts. So, or TUEs. Filing whereabouts is much easier than before, but how about TUEs? Is it easier now to file TUEs than before, Alexis?
I don't think so. I think there's been a lot of work being done into trying to explain what the requirements are for paperwork. So sometimes athletes submit their paperwork and it goes back and forth 4 times or 5 times to try to get the right sort of paperwork. So I think a lot is being done to help the doctors prepare those sorts of packages. But it can still be quite tricky, and, you know, the TUE committees can still want more information sometimes. And I think that's just because they're doing a really thorough job. You know, having to make that decision can be really tough sometimes, and they need all the evidence that they can. So unfortunately, it is still a bit tricky and burdensome, but it's in the interest of having a good independent review and proper process.
Yes, and I guess what's easier is that more information is available. That's the biggest difference. Is
exactly.
You can get the right information much easier than before. All right, we have a couple of questions still. We have time to address, a lot of them pouring in. So Paolo is asking, I learned in some countries, athletes use different systems and not the whereabouts. Is there any plan to centralize this? It would be helpful when planning out of competition tests. I have to check. Honestly, I don't want to give the wrong answer to this one in terms of how the systems that each country uses. I would probably talk to my testing team to make sure that this question is answered correctly. But what do you use in Australia, Alexis?
So we use Atoms as well.
And it would be easier. It would be easier if everyone was using Atoms, and you have now Athlete Central. I'm not sure if there's any plan to centralize this. Perhaps, Paolo, send us an email as well. We'll put our email address up at the end of the presentation so we can get you the right answer in terms of different countries. And I will really look for the guidance of my testing team to see their experience planning tests in different countries. But you're right, it makes things more complicated in certain situations. Stefano is asking about controlled substances but not yet prohibited. What happens to athletes who, for health reasons, take controlled substances, which after WADA update are included in the list of prohibited substances? Athletes who can compete the day before can no longer compete the day after. What should we do in these cases? Have you had that experience, Alexis?
I haven't, but I think the important thing to note is that WADA gives that 3-month window before announcing something being prohibited, before it comes into effect. So normally in September, they will announce that, you know, if it's on the controlled list or if it's just a new substance, then it's going to be banned as of January 1. And that gives that 3-month window for people to stop using it, try to find another alternative, and get it out of their system. So you do get that warning before it gets banned.
And we've seen some high-profile cases, obviously, that we know of where an athlete did not change their regime or their training and I guess the health regime after certain substances were included and tested positive. But there is that gap time to adapt. So it's important to check the prohibited list when it comes out if there are any changes. So it's at least once a year. In very exceptional circumstances, it could be updated more often than that. A question about nicotine. So smoking. Will nicotine be added to the doping list in a few years? I don't know if it will be added, but we do know that substances are added to the prohibited list based on 2 out of 3 criteria. So if it's harmful, if it causes harm or could potentially cause harm to an athlete's health, if it's against the spirit of sport, and if it gives a performance advantage or has the potential to enhance performance. So if 2 of those 3 are met, then it will be added to the list. So of course, there's some consideration there. We know that nicotine is bad for your health. And then we could argue that it goes against the spirit of sport. So it could be added, but we don't know. I'm not involved in the prohibited list committee, and I would be curious, Alexis, if you have any thoughts on it.
Yeah, I mean, it's not banned at the moment, which is probably good to clarify. And I'm sure that the science committee would look at it. But for right now, definitely not banned.
All right, let's give it a few more questions, maybe 3 more minutes, and then we can wrap up. Dominique is asking if there are any guidelines for organizers, how they can communicate with athletes and teams regarding doping. So Dominique, I'm guessing you are referring to major event organizers. So if that's the question, Dominique, for major event organizers, also, of course, they have rules and obligations as per the World Anti-Doping Code in terms of running an anti-doping program during an event and providing some education. So if we're talking about communicating, I'm assuming you're saying education regarding doping, like you said, Dominique. So yes, in theory, major event organizers should follow those guidelines that tell them how and what should be communicated and how a testing program should run. So I hope that answers the question. So a question from Botswana, which substances are banned? I would recommend once again looking at the prohibited list, which is where you can find the most accurate information, and checking on global DRO if you are not sure how to navigate the prohibited list. Is there an organization that provides free or low legal cost defense for athletes accustomed of anti-doping rule violations? Alexis, does anything like that exist nationally?
So in Australia, we've just set up a new tribunal, which at the moment is offering, you can have your anti-doping case heard for free, which is pretty exciting, and also helps with some costs for defence, I think, that they can apply for. And my understanding is that CAS, so the Court of Arbitration for Sport, also offers some legal aid in some instances, and athletes would have to apply for that.
That's correct. So CAS does offer some assistance for athletes in anti-doping rule violations. And I should say this is very important because we are still dealing with such a high number of inadvertent cases where athletes did not necessarily commit an anti-doping rule violation on purpose. So I think that support mechanism is really key. And actually, Mike, I did message our legal team to see if there's anything else that I should mention to you, and I can see them answering to me right now. Yes, of course, the NATOs have a list of pro bono lawyers for athletes, conveying the message from our legal team, but not that many NATOs. So depending on the country, like Alexis said, some may have resources nationally, and then there's the Court of Arbitration for Sport. But Mike, for this, we will have our legal team join us next month. We'll talk about the legal process, and we'll talk about some of the tools and resources that exist in the legal system for athletes. So join us then so we can talk about it in more detail. All right, so it's 3:25. We did not get to, 3:25. I'm talking about Switzerland time, but I know it's middle of the night for you, Alexis, early morning for some of the other audience and Neville. So we have just a few minutes here to wrap up today's session. I am going to share my screen one last time to give you a way to contact us if you have not been able to ask the question, to get answers to your questions, or if something else comes up after this session. So you can stay connected to us. We'll be online every month talking about different topics. We'll publish our webinar registration about 1 to 2 weeks before each session. So please tune in if you find the session relevant to your area or if it's of interest. And I just want to say a big thank you to Alexis and to Neville for joining us today and for contributing your perspectives to this important discussion. I hope you enjoyed it and found it valuable as well.
Yes, thank you.
It was
Thank you for
fantastic.
having me. It's very informative.
Lots of great questions. I'm going to have to check some now.
Yes, and we didn't even get to answer all the questions. So once again, please email us. We'll do our best to get back to you, and we will get back to you, or at least give you the resource that you need. And of course, we will come to you with a survey. It's very short. Please fill it out. Give us your feedback. Tell us what else you want to hear. If you found it valuable or useful today, joining us. And otherwise, stay in touch. We wish you to stay healthy, safe, and well during this difficult time. Some of us are more affected than others, so let's stay patient and hope that we can all see each other face to face sometime soon. So thank you once again. Wishing you a good day, good evening, good night.